19th of Kislev, and people oftentimes wonder what's it all about. So I thought I should give you a little bit of the history of it, and maybe then next week after that we'll get it more into the Hanukkah story. So we'll do some shiurim on that. But in the meantime, let's discuss a little bit about this story, one of the great debates of Jewish history. In fact, I once gave a course on great debates, so I'm going to collect some of the resources we did with that course, and when my PowerPoint downloads here, we'll share that screen so you can get a little bit of the background information on that. But let's go back a little bit into history. I'm talking about late 1600s. There was tremendous devastation that the Jewish people experienced. It was called the Khmelnytsky pogroms. And in fact, the Khmelnytsky pogroms were so bad that Ashkenazic Jews, although on a general Shabbos Mevarchim, we don't recite the prayer of Avarachamim because it's like a special Shabbos Mevarchim, but on the weekends, when it comes to the Shabbos of Shabbos Mevarchim Menachem Av, Sivan, when these Khmelnytsky pogroms took place, or at least when it's commemorated, then we do say Avarachamim, because literally the people at the time experienced a terrible devastation, the oppression, the persecution. Hundreds, I think about 300,000 Jewish people were killed in these pogroms. So other than the Holocaust, it's probably the worst decimation that Jewish people experienced in recent history, or probably since the destruction of the temple. Now, that happens, like I said, mid-1600s. Afterwards comes the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, he initiated a movement that basically breathed new life into the hearts of Jewish people at the time. He was born in 1698. I hope I'm not going to go all over the place, try to give you a little bit of the history. But he started teaching Chassidus. He started to practice as revealing himself as a rabbi from 1734, at the age of 36. And the teachings that he introduced, the teachings of Chassidus, as much as we appreciate them today, how they enlightened, they breathed a whole new, fresh life into the hearts of the Jewish masses, but they were not very well embraced by everyone. They weren't very well accepted. The teachings of Chassidus were regarded with suspicion by many people at the time. There were many Jews who didn't accept it. And it led to some very bitter controversies at the time. So what I'd like to spend today, tomorrow, doing with you is exploring just a little bit of that history and maybe examining some of the writings of the central figures who lived through that era, and to understand what it was that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, how he took the teachings of Chassidus and started the Chabad Chassidic movement. And hopefully this will help us understand, firstly, what the controversy between the Chassidim and the Misnagdim was at the time, and I assume we could take some good and important lessons for our own lives based on that for today. So, where to begin? I'm not going to talk too much about the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, I gave a course on his birthday, on Chai El, which interestingly is the same birthday as the Alter Rebbe. But Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, he presented his position as the way he would teach the Hasidic philosophy as it was formulated by his mentor, Rabbi Dov Ber the Maggid of Mezrich, and then followed on based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, based on mystical Kabbalistic teachings. So as soon as the PowerPoint's ready, I'll try to put up some of those slides for you to give you a little bit of understanding. But the Alter Rebbe himself wrote multiple works. And among the works of scholarship that he created during his lifetime, the one that stands out and that, of course, we all know the Tanya, which we've discussed, and we have many shiurim in the evenings. There's many shiurim on Tanya that you could participate in. But we'll get back to that in a moment and discuss what the controversy about it was. The Tanya was first printed in 1796, and it serves as a practical guide for the average Jew to navigate their personal journey in healthy spiritual alignment. We all are constantly on a journey of personal spiritual development, and it's worthwhile to study Tanya because the Tanya is a book that helps you with finding that anchor. Now, why did he write it? Many people, I was reading the introduction to it, where he says many people are asking his advice, his mentorship on personal matters. And at some stage, it just got too much. There's so many people seeking his guidance. How do you advise, how do you counsel so many people when that's not practically possible? So the solution was to take the most common questions that came his way and to put it into a book that everybody could find those answers. Of course, why were they seeking his counsel? The great rabbi that he was, they wanted the advice that he can dispense, that he could offer on how to live that meaningful life. Now, the Tanya's influence has been very significant. And if you think about today, how many classes, for example, right here in Johannesburg and right here on Zoom and YouTube and Facebook and wherever you want, you could find easily so many classes and discussions. Thousands of Jews worldwide study the entire book in its annual cycle. This book that I use here, usually for our Chumash discussion, it's called a Chitas, Chumash, Tehillim, Tanya. And there are people who study it from the beginning. Now, the Tanya study cycle starts on the 19th of Kislev, on the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. And studying it, many people rely on this, on what they learn from the Tanya, as the driving force behind their personal relationship with God. But as much as Tanya is popular today, at the time of Tanya's initial release, it was, you cannot say it was a bed of roses. It was life was definitely not a bed of roses for the Alter Rebbe, nor for his followers, and for those who studied the Tanya, there was a lot of opposition. In fact, the Alter Rebbe and his students, the Hasidim, were greeted with a heavy dose of skepticism, of cynicism, and there was a full-blown, large-scale animosity, the communal division. Sometimes we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about the hatred from the outside that we Jews experience. But we mustn't neglect or forget that sometimes we have inner conflicts that cause probably a lot more trouble. So when you think about the opposition that they experienced then, whether it was the Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov or the followers of the Alter Rebbe. Somebody's asking me here, what's Hasidim? Okay, good question. Literally, Chassid means pious. So Hasidim would be the plural of pious. The name Hasidim, it's interesting that the Alter Rebbe wrote in his affidavit to the Russian authorities when he was arrested, that those who daven at length were always called Hasidim. And in fact, if you look in the Mishnah, it talks about it in Pirkei Avot or in Tractate Brachos, it talks about a Chassid. In Pirkei Avos it says, who's a Chassid? A person who goes beyond the letter of the law. In the Mishnah, in Brachos, it says that a Chassid is a person who davens, who prays at length. So the masses, they applied the name Hasidim to the students and followers of the Baal Shem Tov because the Baal Shem Tov would daven at length, and it was a Hasidic virtue to not rush through prayers, but to take your time. When the Alter Rebbe was arrested a second time, he added that the enemies insist on calling him Karlinim, not Hasidim, because they wanted to suggest that Hasidim were a new religious sect that didn't have the religious protections that Russia offered to, I guess, all religions at the time, and Jews would be included in those religious protections. They wanted to say, no, these guys are separate, they're different than the Jews. So there was heavy, heavy opposition. In fact, the name that they called themselves, the opposers, those who were Hasidically challenged, they called themselves Misnagdim. Misnagdim are those who opposed. So, I'm not sure exactly which direction to go in. I wasn't planning to elaborate too much on the persecutions against the Hasidim. You could read a lot about that. It's historically chronicled. But, just to put things into perspective, what I was hoping to discuss over the coming days is that, just to give you that perspective, the historical perspective, so that when next week celebrating this Hasidic festival, you know what it's about. So I really don't want to go too deep into the historical discords. Now, in May of 1798, there was libelous testimony against the Alter Rebbe that was written, and it was sent to the Tsar's prosecutor general. And the testimony said something very, very shocking, that the Alter Rebbe was gathering a following of Jewish youth that he was training to live a lifestyle of crime. That was the allegation. And not only that, it said that it was indoctrinating them with the support of revolution. Of revolution. Now, if you think about this, there's a series on Netflix about the history of the overthrow, the revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar. And then, of course, came communism. And what was it, 1990, 91? After the fall of communism, there were researchers who were able to search through the Russian archives, and they found many documents pertaining both to the arrest of the Alter Rebbe, and I want to just read to you one of the points that was made. Give me a second, I just want to check on our PowerPoints to see what's going on, why the PowerPoint is not here yet. Something funny is happening. You would think that the PowerPoint should already be here. Okay. I'll let you know what's going on with it in a moment. Still not here. Okay. As soon as it's here, we'll let you know. Just want to read this to you, what it says. It says, in the Belarusian region, in the town of Lyazhna, a rabbi by the name of Zalman has arisen. He's conspiring and gathering young Jews, all of whom are disobedient, and he's preparing lists with the intention of helping the French Revolution. While they wait to act, they do nothing except live as outlaws and fill their days in indulging in various delights. They eat and drink opulently, and they go around idly. They lead each other astray, they steal and take bribes, and disgrace all their relatives. My own children have stolen all my money, the large sum of 10,000 rubles, and it has made its way to this Rabbi Zalman in Lyazhna. I have not been able to track down my children and the other evil people because of the bribes they've given to the authorities. They also have advocates in St. Petersburg who protect them and their friends. They deserve nothing else but to be drafted into the army and to be sent to the front, or perhaps to exile them permanently to the wilderness. This is just a sample of one such letter that was sent as an accusation against the Alter Rebbe. So to just think of what he had to contend with, what kind of libelous smear campaigns against him. And this wasn't written by anti-Semites. This is written by fellow Jews. Who could have written something like that? That's what you think here. And this was actually written, this letter, according to this book that I'm reading here, was written by a Jew named Hirsch ben David from Vilna. Very, very, hurtful that a fellow Jew could write like that. So, and this wasn't the only case. In this book by Rabbi Monsheim, who basically talks about the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe, he discusses this, and he says that the authorities would eventually learn that actually there was no Jew named Hirsch ben David. It was a pseudonym. How do you call it? A pseudonym, fake name. And these were just anonymously written, pretending, giving names. There was no Hirsch ben David, made up the story against him. There were just troublemakers. And the date that is written on this letter is the 10th of May, 1798. What's interesting is that the compiler of this book, Rabbi Monsheim, points out, if you look at your calendar, the 10th of May, 1798, was Shavuos. Now, no religious Jew would be writing on Shavuos. So either they hired somebody to write it, or they misrepresented. The point, though, is that I'm trying to illustrate to you to what degree the hate, the animosity was. And for what? For a rabbi introducing a different approach, a different path of a way of serving Hashem. Now, I can understand where the suspicion came from. If we go a little bit further back in history, there was a time of Shabtai Tzvi. There was a time when there was false messiahs, and therefore people had that suspicion of a new movement. So, just putting things into perspective. Then you had the French Revolution, which of course they threw into the mix of this all. And that toppled the French monarchy in 1798 and 1789. So Tsarist Russia was taking all threats very seriously. If there was a threat to the existence, to the well-being of the monarchy, of the Tsar, they took such threats very seriously. In fact, like I said, if you want, you could watch the series about the overthrow, the revolution in 1917. So it didn't happen in 1789, but 1917, 128 years later, it did take place. So you understand where the Russians are coming from. Now, in late September of 1798, they actually arrested the Alter Rebbe, and they imprisoned him in St. Petersburg. They suspected him as being a revolutionary. There were various Hasidim who were detained as well, various cities, I'm not just talking about in Russia, in Lithuania too. To fast forward, on the 19th of Kislev, which is the 16th of November, which very interestingly, that is today. Today is the anniversary on the English calendar of the emancipation of the Alter Rebbe. After weeks of imprisonment and interrogation, the Tsar ordered his immediate release of the Alter Rebbe and his Hasidim, and they were exonerated of all charges. They were emancipated from their incarceration. Now, just to read to you a little bit of the text of what this arrest and liberation describes, he says, "Nothing dangerous to the state has been found in the behavior of the Jews who started the sect of the Karlinim." That was the name they called them. "And neither as corruption or anything else that disturbs the peace. He has ordered that all of them be released." Okay, it goes on here about the liberation. I'm not going to read the whole story, but today on the English calendar, the 16th of November, 1798. So this is the anniversary today. It's appropriate that we're discussing this. I didn't realize that till I read this. Okay, so now, on this date, or since then, this date, the 19th of Kislev, has been celebrated as a Hasidic festival, celebration for Hasidim, celebrating the release of the Alter Rebbe. And not only that, because of what happened, he renewed his commitment to teaching and promulgating these teachings of Hasidus. And in fact, very interestingly, he writes, the Alter Rebbe himself wrote something quite remarkable. He says that, and I'm emphasizing this, and I want to share it with you because it's important, and you could see it in the Tanya and in the letters of the Alter Rebbe, where he says we're not here to exact retribution, to fight, or to turn this into a more divisive situation. Let me read the words to you exactly as he says it. He said, it is well known that the sin of divisiveness and baseless hatred is very severe. It is therefore fitting for all upstanding and God-fearing people to be cautious, to an extreme degree not to cause even indirectly any detriment in this regard. It is difficult to pen in a letter a true and deep feeling of my heart, which is to awaken in the hearts of our community a love for each other, even to those who are not inclined to help us, because this is part of the mitzvah of Avat Yisrael, to love all our fellow Jews. It was for this reason that last year, after the passing of the pious Gaon of Vilna, may his memory be for a blessing, I wrote a stern warning to all members of our community not to utter even a trace of negative speech about this great Torah scholar in the wake of his passing, with no exceptions. My own side note that I want to say here is, the Vilna Gaon himself was very much a misnagid, very against the Hasidic movement. I hope I didn't just violate the words Alter Rebbe writes here. But the point I'm making is why he's saying to be very careful. He's a great scholar, a great rabbi. For whatever reason, he didn't embrace our movement. But the Alter Rebbe says, I don't want any opposition, any disrespect to him. And now he's saying, now even though he sat needlessly in jail for these allegations, these false claims against him, he says, I don't want to perpetuate the cycle of violence. And therefore, he says, you just translate, but now, because of the distressing times that we've just experienced, I'm concerned that some may think that this prohibition has been lifted. God, I guess he's saying that you think that because the trouble these misnagdim caused me, now you have permission to go fight with them. Given that the perpetrators of our suffering relied on the late pious great sage, may his memory be for a blessing. The Alter Rebbe is emphasizing this. Therefore, I have come to warn everyone once again, whether they reside near or far, with a double and redoubled warning. Do not permit yourself to open your mouth and tongue against the honor of the Torah, the honorable and righteous Gaon of blessed memory. For it is known to us with certainty that this oppression did not originate with him, God forbid, and that he did not advocate aggressive measures against us. Indeed, such an error did not come from the Master for as long as he lived. Additionally, I demand and request of all you to accustom your hearts to love everyone, to judge them favorably, and those who do not support, even those who do not support us. For the real truth is that all of us are literally like siblings. And as he quotes a verse here, it says, "You, Bani Matam Hashem, you're children of God." And the Talmud teaches that we are called God's children regardless of our behavior, as it says in Tractate Kedushin. Thus, God is surely saddened and grieved when we harbor hatred and animosity in our hearts towards those who oppose us. Therefore, one whose heart is touched with the awe of heaven must fulfill that which is written, to not harbor evil in your heart against another. And then, as water reflects the image of the face looking into it, so will the jealousy and rivalry dissipate from their hearts. Beautiful letter. Keep on reading here, but the point is the letter continues and he concludes saying that he's asking anyone who hears someone violating this warning to report it to him. He says, I don't want to perpetuate more hatred, more conflict. We need to put an end to it. And I think about reading this letter. There's a few important points that come from this. First of all, the Alter Rebbe tells us about the Gaon of Vilna and his connection to this whole story. Okay? And what I want to first do is to share my screen with you, because finally, one of my PowerPoints from previous shiur has downloaded. So now I could share the screen with you and give you just a little bit more background information. So give it a second. Share the screen. Sorry, it's not as smooth and as some of our other ones. But here we go. Okay. Here we are. So we're talking about the Alter Rebbe. You can see a picture of him, a portrait of the Alter Rebbe. And what you see on the right-hand side over here is the cover, the what do you call this? The opening page of Tanya. So this is the book of Tanya that he authored. He authored several books. He actually authored a book on Jewish law as well. But here I'm just showing you the Tanya that he wrote. Okay, so that's Alter Rebbe, that's the Tanya. Let's discuss a little bit further. So we talked before about the libel, the libelous testimony against the Alter Rebbe in May of 1798, just to put the picture of everything back together. He was imprisoned in September and was emancipated on Yud Tes Kislev, the 16th of November, today in 1798. So that's the story in short of the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe. Let's see. Okay, so now I just read this letter to you. So what I'm going to do is go on from the letter. Now let's talk about what we glean from this letter. So firstly, we see how the Alter Rebbe tells us that the Vilna Gaon and its connection to the story. He says not to blame the Vilna Gaon for his involvement. You know, you think about this personality. In fact, I was at a meeting at Rankislachte just before, and one of the ladies, Jill, was telling us how she is the direct descendant of the Vilna Gaon. He was a towering Jewish scholar of the 18th century. And although I don't think he held any official office positions, and I'm not even sure if he served as a rabbi or Rosh Yeshiva or as a dayan in his community, but he's very well known and recognized for his extraordinary achievements in the study of all fields of Torah, including mysticism, Kabbalah, which is interesting because that was what a lot of the opposition of the Hasidic movement was against the mystical aspects of the teachings. Okay? So that itself is interesting. What else can I tell you about him? He was called the Gra, the Gaon Rabbi Eliyahu, so it's an acronym of his name. He opposed the Hasidim. Okay, well, we'll talk about that just now. In fact, he signed a ban against Hasidim in 1772, and that's his involvement. Now, he passed away in 1797. So this letter that I just read to you, the Alter Rebbe informs us that immediately after the Gra's passing, he sends this letter to his Hasidim warning them against speaking negatively about the Gra. He wants to make sure that this doesn't turn into any type of, cahoodle. He says you have to love your fellow Jew. He recognizes that we are spiritual beings, and the honor due to the Gra for his achievements in Torah is non-negotiable. But after his arrest and liberation, the Alter Rebbe was concerned that the Hasidim might think they could do as they please, because those people responsible for the slander leading to the arrest, they were acting, at least according to their own assertions, they were acting in accordance with the wishes of the Gra. So the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that the Gra cannot be blamed for this arrest. And he says the fact that these libelous claims were only registered after the Gra's passing is proof of such. That there were unscrupulous actors who were responsible for this persecution, and although they justified their behavior by citing the Gra's opposition to Hasidim, he said their tactics were not something that the Gra would have supported in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, the Alter Rebbe made a very similar point in his affidavit for his arrest. He said that even though the leaders of Vilna pushed the Gra to take aggressive measures against Hasidim, and in fact they convinced him to sign a ban, a cherem against them, that the Hasidim were problematic Jews and were trouble, but nevertheless, he said, I don't blame the Vilna Gaon for this controversy. It's interesting. There's a story on Isser Chag Shavuos, 1853. A Farbrengen was held in the home of Rabbi Yossel, who was the son of the Maggid of Lubavitch, a preacher in Lubavitch. And at that Farbrengen, Rabbi Isaac Humler described the setting in the rabbinic courts of Vilna and Slutsk when they issued the edicts, these erroneous edicts against the Hasidim, and encouraged staunch opposition to the movement. So Rabbi Isaac, who knew those rabbis personally, called out the names of those who participated in the libels against the Alter Rebbe in 1798. He described their erudition in Torah, their righteousness, their wholesomeness. He also described their sadness, their regret, and their great shame now that they had passed away and are in the world of truth, where they realized the extreme of their error. So Reb Isaac was showing that the people who did this were themselves well-educated individuals. Some of them were even rabbis. And during his talk, Reb Hillel of Parich began to weep very, very much. And those who were around him, they asked him, why was he crying? And Reb Hillel calmed down and he explained. He said, if in the earlier generations, the great and wholesome scholars could make such a drastic, terrible error that they would accuse the Alter Rebbe of these terrible crimes and cause such terrible persecution, then in this generation, we're talking about 1853, when the bar of scholarship and righteousness, he says, has been lowered, and the error of opposition to Hasidim is now well known, it's well documented, it's been proven. How much greater is the sin of those who continue to oppose the Hasidim? And woe to them for the great shame that they bring upon themselves. He says, how can I not cry when I heard clearly from, he was talking about the Mittler Rebbe who passed away, his yahrzeit was 3 days ago. He says, we know that Avas Yisrael, the importance of love and care for one another. And yet there are still people who will have these libelous claims, who still make trouble, who could still be misnagdim. So that was one point that I think is important, is that the Alter Rebbe clarifies, even though the Vilna Gaon had a role, but we're not putting the blame on him. Another important point that we see from this letter is how the Alter Rebbe responded to the whole episode of opposition that he and his Hasidim faced. The Alter Rebbe and some Hasidim had just spent weeks in a Russian prison as a direct outcome of a deliberate libel that included allegations of treason. They accused the Alter Rebbe of revolutionary activity. They accused him of supporting a foreign government. The Turks, who at that stage were controlling Israel, were in truth, he was just sending charity to the Jews who resided in Israel. We all know that the common reaction to an attack is to first of all, we respond aggressively. And we gloat for overcoming it. But the Alter Rebbe did differently. The Alter Rebbe displayed an incredible lack of interest in any form of retaliation. He really didn't want a perpetuation of a cycle of hatred, of back and forth, of tit for tat. The Alter Rebbe insisted that the Hasidim develop themselves to the point that they literally feel an emotional love towards those very people who have caused them and their beloved leaders so much suffering. And he says this wasn't just possible. He says this was obligatory because of the spiritual connection between their souls that remained intact despite those individuals' failure to behave as siblings should. And he says, judge them favorably despite all that. And just think about that. You know, teacher was once telling the kids about the importance in the Ten Commandments. It says, honor your father and mother. Say, this kid says, is there any commandment to honor your brother and sister? And the teacher says, yeah, it says, thou shalt not kill. The point is we're family. We're fellow Jews. How can we not behave as family? And one always has to be that adult. We could always continue and fight, and the fight just continues. But for the Alter Rebbe, the teachings of the Torah, Jewish mysticism, it wasn't detached from life. It informed life. Where most people would have had no qualms of embarrassing their enemies. The Alter Rebbe's consciousness was, no, we need to have a deep sense of love. The Alter Rebbe was a living example of the extent to which we can get beyond the pitfalls of our personalities when we take the teachings of our Judaism seriously. We apply them practically into our lives. And he taught and he encouraged his followers to live that way. Not just to teach, not just to preach, but to actually live that way. And in fact, the idea expressed in this very letter that I read to you was a central theme of the Alter Rebbe's approach to Judaism. It lies at the heart of his book of Tanya, the basic discipline of Chabad Hasidic philosophy is to use our mind, moyach shalit al halev, by empowering it with information about spiritual truths, to mold a renewed emotional profile that affects our relationship with God as well as our relationship with other people around us. And in fact, the heart of Tanya is Perek Lamed Beis, chapter 32, Leiv, the heart of Tanya. And in this chapter, he discusses exactly that unconditional love, not to exact retribution, not to retaliate, not to take revenge. That's what lies at the heart of what the Chabad philosophy teaches and advocates. And that's certainly the idea that we want to emphasize. So, I'll share with you a few lines that I saw. They say, what kills a skunk is the publicity it gives itself. Came from Abraham Lincoln. Here's a French one. Charles de Gaulle said, the graveyards are full of indispensable men. And here I thought I was indispensable, whatever happened. Here's one from Helen Nielsen. Humility is like underwear, essential, but indecent if it shows. Do you know what keeps me humble? Mirrors. Here's one more. If I only had a little humility, I would be perfect, right? The point, I think, very well we could see is how the Alter Rebbe, how he really emphasized that very idea. I think it's quite humbling, quite amazing, that despite the persecution and despite the arrest from fellow Jews who slandered him, when he was finally freed, he demanded from his Hasidim that they love their fellow Jews and judge them favorably, even those who cause them great distress. And this was obligatory as the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. And it was possible to achieve this love by considering that unbreakable, soul-based brotherhood that we are a family. And so he clarified that not to blame the Vilna Gaon, he had nothing to do with his arrest. He says the Vilna Gaon would never have allowed something of this sort to ever take place in his lifetime, which is in fact why this all happened after he passed away. And that's why he reiterated that previous warning that no one was allowed to speak disparagingly about the Vilna Gaon. And tomorrow, please God, we'll go further into this. And I want to talk about the reconciliation that ultimately did happen. There was a reconciliation, and how eventually Hasidim, today we don't have, yes, there's certainly politics in Jewish organizations, there's no doubt about that. And there's certainly competition between one shul and another. That all exists. All businesses have it. But I don't think we have that opposition that once existed, at least for the most part. Yeah, there might be a few exceptional cases of haters, but I don't think we really have it as it was back then. What I want to do to conclude today is I want to just share with you a fascinating letter from, I think it's the son of the Alter Rebbe. Let me just quickly find it here. And what I'd like to do is just share this with you because I think it's just interesting and fascinating to read. So I'll share it with you, and then tomorrow we'll get into the reconciliation, how that happened back then, and of course you got to apply it into your own, into our own situations today. So just give me a second here. Where did I put it? You would think that I'd be organized. Okay, here we go. So here, this is just some letters. It's a few letters I have here on peace, and these are letters both from the Alter Rebbe. We see how he responded during this whole episode of the controversy, of the conflict, and the dispute, and how he led his followers through that period, even though it was a very difficult period. And let me start with this letter that I have in front of me here. This letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote to his Hasidim in Vilna. Now, Vilna, you have to understand, is not just the capital of Lithuania. Vilna was also the capital of the Misnagdim, of the antagonistic movement against the Hasidim. And so let me read here this letter he writes. Let me just find it quickly. Okay. He says, Pesach Devorai, I open my words with an apology for the delay in my responding till now. So I guess this letter is being written to a particular person. Okay, who he's writing it to, I'm uncertain, but let me just continue reading it. Okay, it says, this was not betrayal or breach of faith, nor was I neglecting your words, God forbid. In fact, we're very much troubled by all your troubles, which are actually the troubles of all of us. As our sages relate, the day that disputes abounded between the students of Hillel and Shammai was difficult for the Jews, like the day on which the golden calf was made. Now think about it. On the one hand, the disputes between Hillel and Shammai were how to interpret and understand Torah. But the fact that people were fighting, the fact that existed, was disturbing. And he quotes a line from the Talmud that says, the Torah became like two Torahs. Now, of course not. But the fact that there was such animosity and debate, and this is discussed in the Gemara and Tractate Shabbos, that one day the followers of Shammai were in the majority, and they enacted 18 laws that Hillel disagreed with. Hillel, on the other hand, was the Nasi. He was the leader of the community. He descended from illustrious people. And so what did Hillel do? He went to sit among the students. He was embarrassed. He was ashamed that his perspective was, now you could say this is like a democracy. Okay? But the Gemara nevertheless says it was as grievous to Israel as the day in which the golden calf was made. Why? It's talking about the humiliation of the great sage Hillel, who most laws do follow the ways of Hillel. Okay, so the first thing I'm taking from this letter is where he's really against this conflict. The Alter Rebbe's Hasidim in Vilna were obviously suffering from antagonism, from persecution of their fellow Jews, and it was causing them tremendous, great distress. So they wrote to the Alter Rebbe describing the situation, and they thought of ways to retaliate. But remember the letter we saw before. Alter Rebbe was completely against retribution. And so the Alter Rebbe did not respond right away, as you could see from the way he says, I apologize for my delay. And he expressed his sympathy with them. And he goes on to say that the dispute in Vilna is not just your problem, it's a problem for all of us if we can't get along. We're supposed to be a family. We're one Jewish community. And we're having fights with each other. We all suffer at the end of the day when there's friction and discord and mutinies in the community. In fact, communal infighting is so unfortunate, it's so damaging that he says it's comparable to the golden calf. Of course, unfortunately, that hasn't ended. This morning I was dealing with a situation of a particular family who was fighting, of course, fighting over money. And although I know money is a wonderful thing and could get us to lots of good places and do lots of good for us, when I hear how sometimes money causes such faribbles, so disheartening. You say rather be poor and happy than rich and miserable. So the first thing that I'm taking out of this letter is the way he discusses, the way he says that it's like a golden calf. It's as notorious, as terrible, as horrible as the golden calf. And then he goes on, I'm just going to read a little bit more into this letter, to discuss, they talk about how they want to respond, how they want to retaliate. So let me just continue on this note. And just by the way, the Gemara says that although Hillel was humiliated, he ignored, he walked out of his seat. He went to his place. So the Gemara says that when many students of Hillel and Shammai didn't serve their teachers faithfully, because their teachers, Hillel and Shammai themselves, were great sages. They may have been sparring partners, but they did it l'shem Shammai. They did it for the sake of preserving Torah and making sure that the Torah is properly interpreted. Some of their students, they took it out of hand. They made it into a personal matter. So, that's problematic. And maybe that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, is that don't blame the great Gaon of Vilna. He's not the person who caused this. They only did this after he passed away. So let's just read a little bit further. He says, you've asked me a very difficult question to share from afar my perspective about your plan. But this is a novel plan. And I did not observe my teachers employing this approach, taking revenge. He says, no. And he goes on, he writes, in 1772, the community of Brody published the proclamation made in Vilna against us. They also added other notes with many additional words, complete lies and falsehoods, which were harsh as bitter plants and the venom of vipers. The booklets were spread throughout the entire diaspora. The extent of the disgrace and torments suffered by the renowned holy righteous men of Vilna. So, or maybe, I don't know if this is another city. It's written in Hebrew, Volin. Maybe it's another city, sorry. Somewhere, maybe in Ukraine or Poland. I'm not exactly sure. Okay, but the point he's saying is that there was tremendous opposition. And the lies were unbelievable. They could no longer reside in their homes, so they all came to Ravna to take shelter under the wings of our late great Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich. They sought to draw up a plan of appropriate response. There were many conceivable ways to destroy and annul the plans of the attackers. We could have written, published, and distributed many more bitter accusations against them than they had written against us. And these would have all been true. And truth endures. there were also other means available at the time. So the Alter Rebbe is saying, we've dealt with this before. And we've experienced suffering before. This is not novel. This is not new. He's describing 20 years earlier when he was a student of Rabbi Dov Ber the Maggid of Mezrich. And he says in this earlier incident, the opponents of Hasidim published bans, and they wrote defamatory stories about the Hasidim. They circulated them as widely as they could, as he says, throughout the diaspora. They wanted, obviously, to have a maximum possible impact. And he says the defamation was so bad that these people had to move out of their homes, out of their cities of residence. They moved to a different city, to Ravna, which was where Rabbi Dov Ber the Maggid of Mezrich was. And they considered, what's their plan of action? What is their retaliatory tactics? And in this letter, the Alter Rebbe informed his followers that they had obviously a few options available. They could write letters, they could write, very damning information, and clarify all the malicious letters that were written against them in this whole smear campaign. And he said that would be clearly permissible to do, to defend, to clear your name. You don't have to turn the other cheek when somebody's maligning you, when somebody's defaming you. Definitely, that's not a Jewish way of turning the other cheek. But he said, what do we actually do? So let me continue and conclude this letter to you. He says, but our great rabbi of blessed memory did not choose retaliatory options. He said that the power of Jews is in their tongues to cry out to God. That's what we do. We cry out to Hashem. So of course we could take revenge, but that's not what we're going to do. We encourage them to pray to Hashem. Now, look at our parsha this week. What does Yaakov do? He's going to his brother. He prepares in 3 ways. Is this practical? Is it productive? It's very nice to preach peace and love, and even nicer to practice it. But as King Solomon says in Kohelet, I think, in Ecclesiastes, that there's a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So why should we be holding on to peace in a situation where aggressive self-defense might seem more appropriate? Now, you can argue the merits and demerits of this approach, but this is what the Alter Rebbe writes. I could show you in the parsha that Yaakov prepares for war. But let me just conclude the letter so you see what the Alter Rebbe's approach was. He says, with regard to our opponents, the following verse came to fruition. A lying tongue is for but a moment. Again, this is from King Solomon and Mishlei and Proverbs. He says that a lying tongue is for but a moment, for their pamphlets of propaganda have ceased to circulate. As for us, the following verse came to fruition. Your affliction was to benefit you in your end. And your beginning shall be small, but your end will increase exceedingly. We observed how soon thereafter our movement has grown to number tens of thousands in many regions. The Jewish masses saw through the extreme lies that our opponents fabricated against us. When they incited the world in opposition to us with a great uproar and tumult, this clamoring aroused those who were in a spiritual slumber to awaken and to see that the light of Hasidim was good. They were able to differentiate between truth and falsehood, of which sheker ein la raglayim, falsehood has no feet and cannot endure. It's an expression from the Gemara. The Gemara says that if you look at the word sheker, okay, that the letter shin stands for sheker, and therefore this letter, when properly written, has a very narrow point at the bottom, which shows it can't stand on its own. And the point, of course, the Gemara is telling us is that lies are eventually discovered. Sheker ein la raglayim. Lies can't endure. If, however, he says, we had not suffered quietly, accepting the pain with love, okay, when a person's suffering and doesn't have the ability to do anything to stop it, what's the proper, the proper way to react is to accept the suffering as a sign of God's love and accept it with love, as difficult as that might be. That's what the Talmud talks about when a person's ill. But he says, we had we instead initiated quarrels and disputes, what would have happened? The fights would have continued, and the truth would never be seen. Okay, because he quotes the Gemara that says in Sanhedrin that a quarrel is like a burst of water. Once water begins to burst through a crack in a structure, the crack will continue to widen, and more water will rush through it. And similarly, says the Alter Rebbe, a dispute can start as something minor, but it will soon rage out of control. So he's telling us that his teacher, the Maggid, was afraid that a counterattack would only serve to escalate the conflict, which would, of course, exacerbate an already problematic situation. Aside from the evils that we discussed earlier of fighting, would have made both parties look equally quarrelsome. And what would happen? What will we gain by having more fights in the Jewish community? So therefore, he says, my teacher insisted no retaliation, no retribution. And he says, then, when the flames of the conflict eventually calmed down, died down completely, and in the meantime, because of the tumult, thousands of more people who observed the conflict and observed the behaviors of both parties, so many were attracted to the peaceful posture of the Hasidim, and so many decided to investigate at least the teachings of the Maggid, to see what this is all about. And they saw that the claims were false, and the teachings of the Hasidim were indeed especially meaningful. And the result was that the number of Hasidim grew considerably. And so, he says, we see very clearly that fighting, counterattacks aren't useful. And he said they should tolerate the suffering silently, quietly. Keep in mind the Talmudic saying, the Gemara says, if one word is worth a sela, a certain coin, was a unit of currency in those days, silence is worth two. And he goes on to bless them and expresses hope that the troubles will soon subside and will give way to peace and tranquility. But when I think about this, it takes a true master of self-control to be able to make a truly rational decision about how to respond when you're feeling angry. We're angry about something, we're frustrated, we're hurt, we're insulted. It's not easy, many people can't do this. So the next time that, this is the takeaway for today, we'll conclude here. I think the next time we're in a situation where we're itching to react to something someone has done wrong to us, we shouldn't get overcome with emotion, with the feelings in the moment. Don't react in the moment. Tell yourself that you'll respond appropriately, but you'll wait a day or two and address it then. By that time, you're likely to be far less strongly under the influence of that emotional feeling, the anger, the anxiety, the stress of the moment. And I think we react very differently in those situations. So that's my takeaway from this discussion for today. I think there's a lot more to talk about, but we'll continue, please God, tomorrow. And that to me is, if we take a lesson out of this story, there's a lot to learn about how to navigate disputes and difficult situations that we encounter in life. But I think if there's one thing we could take from it, is that we shouldn't rush into responses, but let it calm down, let the situation simmer a little bit, as the Alter Rebbe clearly says over here. Okay, ladies and gents, thank you all for joining today. Look forward, please God, to... Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I mean, chas v'sholom, not to compare, but we saw this in Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
We
It's
did.
it's a truly noble act, I think, of a
Yes,
leader to be able
yes.
to say that we, to be able to behave and react in this way. It's not easy.
No.
But I mean, the letter I was reading before, the Alter Rebbe basically says that a kindness, that the way that we shouldn't fight and we shouldn't perpetuate the cycle. That's the way he put it.
Mm, mm.
So I think it's certainly a good way could learn from the greats of the world about how to deal with situations.
So, thank you, Rebbe.
Okay. Any other
Thank you.
points or questions anyone has? Come on, ladies, gents, nobody. Okay. See you tomorrow, please God. Same time, same place. We'll continue this discussion and get an understanding of what the Yutas Kislev celebrations are about. Is there a word in English that can explain or define the meaning of the word Hasidus? Is a question that's written here. A word in English that explains Hasidus. Meaning. I mean, I think some will say Hasidism, but I don't know if that helps any more than Hasidus. But it's the teachings of the Hasid. That's literally what Hasidus is. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow, please, God.